Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Even though Andor is technically about Cassian Andor's journey, the first season of the show really focuses a lot on Luthen Rael. I would go as far to say that he is the highlight of that show. He also might be my favorite Star Wars character ever. And I think it has a lot to do with just how interesting the character is. The performance, of course, is excellent as well, and also the clarity that this spy master has. While everyone else, from Mon Mothma to Andor to even Imperials like Cyril Karn and Dedra Meero, are still finding their footing and discovering their path in life, it's clear that Luthen Rael is closer to the end of his journey. Even though Luthen Rael has this clarity of purpose, there's really nothing simple about the very complex decisions he makes as he's building this rebellion.
I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do.
15 years ago is when Luthen Rael started his journey. The Clone Wars had just ended, Order 66 had happened, and the Empire had risen. I know people tend to have a very negative view on the Empire, but you have to put yourself in the mindset of the average person living in the Empire in those first few years. For the majority of the people in the galaxy, peace was far more important than any political labels or government structure. All people wanted was enough stability so that they could rebuild their lives and return to some type of normalcy. Emperor Palpatine was widely popular at the time. Not only had he protected the Republic and steered it towards victory during the Clone Wars, he also survived an assassination attempt, further reinforcing this image of him as a strong man who can take care of all of the problems the galaxy faced. On top of that, people who had been unemployed for years were now seeing plenty of employment opportunities within the federal government and military. There are also plenty of jobs in the newly upgraded and fastly growing industrial military complex. It's safe to say in the first few years of Imperial rule, the majority of people would have been against any type of insurrection, insurgents, any kind of rebellion, because they would probably associate that to the separatist movement, which caused all that destruction in the previous conflict. And again, I can't stress this enough. This rings true in the Star Wars world and also in our own. Most people are not ideologically driven. Sure, they'll tell you they support democracies and checks and balances, but most people are likely too busy with their lives to really do anything about it. And I would argue that Palpatine made sure people were way too busy working in mines or doing patrols in the Outer Rim to do anything about it. And that is kind of what makes Luthen Rael so special. It's one thing to join the rebellion after the destruction of Alderaan when the galaxy was outraged, or after the Battle of Endor when the Imperials were on the run. But to be in the first wave, the vanguard of the revolution, is a very different thing. As a matter of fact, take a look at what happened to the other two Day 1 rebels, Bail Organa and Saw Gerrera. They both died in tragic mining accidents. Bail Organa was the idealist. He came from the political world and he used his influence and resources to build a backbone for the rebel military. Saw Gerrera was an asymmetric warfare specialist. He would attack the Empire's soft underbelly for more than 2 decades. Luthen Rael's Axis network did a bit of both. They attempted to organize the various rebel factions in a more coherent way so that they could fight the Empire together. They also carried out raids and had many intelligence operatives. But most importantly, Luthen Rael is an instigator. This is a role that every revolution needs to have, and it is probably one of the most thankless and dangerous roles to have, because you are causing a ton of damage. You are making a lot of enemies with your actions. When Palpatine took over, he spent massive amounts of money hiring Imperial citizens to join the military, the government, and industrial labor force. On many planets, they were the largest employer in town. I cannot stress how important this is for the kind of zeitgeist of the moment, right? We are lifting people out of poverty. We're giving them opportunities to be nationalistic and, love and patriotic, which, people like. Like, I like being nationalistic. I like being patriotic, even though sometimes it's kind of stupid and can lead to bad outcomes. But this is the environment that Palpatine created. He created loyalty through service, loyalty through employment. And he believed that if he brought enough people into the system, then how could there be a rebellion if everyone was working for the Empire? The victors of a conflict usually get to write the history, and the New Republic kind of glosses over this early Imperial period because Palpatine was literally turning war refugees into, skilled craftsmen and military officers. Things truly were getting better for the average person, especially if you compare their lives to what it was like during, again, the Clone Wars. If you take a look at how rebellions form in our own history, oftentimes you do have a very radical and, group of extremists who start the revolution, but really things don't kick off until the middle class or the average citizen kind of joins into the fray. And this only happens when the masses experience deprivation. This could be economic deprivation. If an individual feels like they can no longer make enough money to provide for themselves, or if they have a family, this can lead to them rebelling. Or maybe they're seeing limitations to their religious freedom. Maybe you can't, worship the Force like you used to because Palpatine hates the Jedi. Or maybe there's a limitation to your political freedom. This affects a smaller group of people, but yeah, some people really want their voices to be heard in the Galactic Senate. This kind of deprivation has to reach such a high level where society shuts down. And this is extremely difficult to do, especially in a period like the early Empire, where things are generally trending upwards. For an Imperial citizen to really join the revolution, there must be an assessment of risk and opportunity costs. They must ask themselves, well, will my life get better if I join the rebellion? And I think for most people in 20 BBY, the clear answer was no. We gotta stay away from this. Very few individuals were romanticizing war in this period of time. Most people understood the high cost of conflict. Another unexpected consequence from the Sith's fake Clone Wars. Equally as important, people who have lived through very chaotic and unstable times are more willing to abandon the previous government, which in this case had a relatively weak central government with no standing military, which is what led to a massive conflict in the first place, probably. The Empire, as a military-first government ruled by a strong man who has just won the last war, is a lot more appealing for these people. And so, yeah, we have a civilian population that is willing to tolerate a lot of nonsense from the Empire because the alternative is just way too scary. And this is where the instigator Luthen Rael comes in. Notice how he comes from a higher class in society. He clearly is wealthy and very cultured. He has connections with many of the elites in galactic society. I would argue that he was in a better position than the common working man to see what exactly was happening to the Republic. While the average laborer or soldier was just too busy, doing whatever they needed to provide for their family, Luthen Rael probably had a lot of spare time, enough that he could devote all of his energies and resources to a startup rebellion movement. And equally as important, he had a strong enough ego where he believed that he could actually bring change to the galaxy. I wouldn't be surprised if Luthen Rael in 20 BBY was much closer in personality to the character he plays in his shop, a charismatic individual who loves company and parties. And when you juxtapose that to his real face, how he actually looks, well, you can see the toll all of this has taken on him.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm. Kindness, kinship, love.
I mean, come on, Lonnie, you walked right into that. I'm sure in every free moment, Luthen Rael thinks about the consequences of his actions and wonders if he did the right thing.
I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them.
I mean, this really hits hard. I mean, think about it. For Luthen Rael to have started this movement, he had to be ideological from the very beginning of things. And I'm imagining because he lived on Coruscant, he was probably insulated from a lot of the crazy stuff the Empire was doing, especially in the Outer Rim. And so he really didn't have a reason to rebel. I don't think the Empire affected him directly. This means he supported the ideas of the Republic, of democracy, of equal rights for all sentient beings, and just common decency and fairness in society. He had values. But because of the difficulty of his mission, he had to set a lot of these beliefs, a lot of his ideology to the side, and that is definitely not easy. Remember, he was extreme enough to start the rebellion, but somehow practical and rational enough to remove these more extreme sides of him. He became a tool for the rebellion. In the early Empire, you're more likely to run into Imperial sympathizers than you are to find support amongst your populace. You really can't trust anyone and have to be willing to do some truly horrendous things to survive. I mean, blackmailing your informant is not really a nice thing to do, but it's necessary for the Axis network to have a mole in the ISB. Calling a hit on Cassian Andor is not a really nice thing to do, but let's be honest, the guy was pretty mercenary and probably a loose end that needed to be cut off, especially after the Aldhani heist, which was the trigger, I believe, for the entire conflict. You guys remember the horrific look that Mon Mothma had on her face when she realized what Luthen Rael was doing?
We need them to overreact.
You can't be serious.
The Empire has been choking us so slowly we're starting not to notice. The time has come to force their hand.
Luthen Rael, the instigators. Rebellions, like a lot of different movements, have different phases. Heck, during Luthen Rael's time, there wasn't even a name for the rebellion. Eventually, they called it the Alliance to Restore the Republic, and then after Yavin, it was the Rebel Alliance, and then after Andor, In an attempt to legitimize themselves, they became the New Republic. At every stage of the rebellion, you needed different types of leaders whose skills were well suited for that moment in history. Just like how a company needs different leaders in different phases of its development. Steve Jobs helped create all of those visionary products that launched Apple into the stratosphere. Tim Cook, who took over afterwards, lacks that same creative vision, but is probably one of the leading experts in the world when it comes to supply chain management. And he has squeezed every piece of efficiency out of the company, which is why it was so profitable. These were two very different individuals who both served their purpose during different times in this company's history. The rebellion is no different. In those early days when the entire galaxy was asleep, individuals like Mon Mothma in her gilded birdcage on Coruscant wasn't ready to do what Luthen Rael was ready to do. The rebellion really needed someone like Luthen. They needed him to force the Empire into passing draconian laws that essentially tossed the wide net across the galaxy and incarcerated and oppressed a huge number of relatively innocent people. Remember, we talked about the deprivation the average citizen needs to turn into a rebel? Well, throwing people unjustly into prison, into a labor camp, well, that provides a lot of deprivation. Mon Mothma was not ready to deliver such suffering to the people, but Luthen Rael was willing to risk it. Either that or he was just running out of energy after maintaining this rebellion for 15 years. You know, the sad thing about all this is, despite Luthen Rael being crucial to the rebellion's success, if you take a look at the New Republic era, there aren't any statues commemorating him. He's not mentioned in the same, sentences as Luke Skywalker and Princess Leia, or even Mon Mothma. He's pretty much a forgotten character in history.
My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, that set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearned to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I looked down, there was no longer any ground beneath my feet.
The honesty we get from Luthen Rael when he's talking to Lonie and Saw Gerrera is a bit alarming for me. It's a troubling sign for a spy master who has maintained this double life, this secrecy, for so long. It's clear that he's become increasingly destabilized because of the actions he must take for the rebellion. He speaks about being led headfirst into a conflict that he didn't realize would be so devastating to who he is. Right? His ego, his willingness to fight are what put him in this situation, and he recognizes it. I wonder if he regrets this path he's taken. And after 15 years of living this life, Luthen Rael really has no foundation anymore. There's nothing below his feet. He has no principles and no morals. He only has the rebellion, and this is eating him alive. I mean, I think very few people understand just what kind of sacrifice it is to just throw away your values for some higher cause. It's not obvious. It's devoid of ego and narcissism because Luthen Rael has turned himself into a monster. He accepts the label that history will give him. He understands that his dangerous actions will invite further imperial reactions, and many innocent people are going to die as a result. As a matter of fact, he will kill or eliminate allies that prove to be incompetent and dangerous to his mission. There's this moment where Luthen Rael explains to Saw Gerrera the situation with Anton Krieger, and Saw Gerrera just tells Luthen Rael, well, this is war. And I think it's funny that Saw Gerrera understands Luthen better than almost everyone else, in the rebellion, even though Saw's kind of crazy. But that is the company that Luthen Rael has to keep. Luthen sacrificing Anton Krieger's forces in order to protect Lonie is not all that different from the decision the Allies made during World War II when they cracked the Enigma machine used by the Nazis. They didn't act on all of the information they got from the Enigma machine, and so thousands of soldiers and sailors died because of this. But ultimately, one could argue that because the Allies had access to German communique, it shortened the war by many years and probably saved millions of lives. Some people will get Luthen Rael and why he did what he did, especially in times of war when there's really no room for nonsense. But what happens when peace arrives, when things get easier, when people start complaining about very little things? How will people start to look at Luthen Rael? The New Republic, within just a few years, would start harboring neo-imperialists who are nostalgic about the old days. The New Republic would lose sight of what was important almost immediately after the war ends. So don't for one second believe that Luthen Rael will not be put on trial if he survives this conflict because of some kind of political nonsense. But before that even happens, I think Luthen Rael is already at the end of his rope. He acknowledges it. He's tired. It's tiring to live a life like this, full of lies and horrible things, especially when you are actually a decent person. It's tiring to not recognize yourself in the mirror anymore. He's also done way too much damage now to the Empire. Things are only going to get worse for him. The only thing that's really keeping him alive right now is his desire to destroy the Empire. But if he begins to realize that there is another who can take up his mantle, perhaps lead the rebellion as it evolves into a new entity where he no longer is necessary, maybe then that is his way out. Because I definitely think he wants out. I personally think, given his relationship with Mon Mothma, he will ultimately sacrifice himself for her so that she can escape from Coruscant after the Gorman massacre. He will finally find some measure of peace in death, in the ability to finally sacrifice himself instead of pawns, right? Something that probably weighs heavily on him.
30 men.
Plus Krieger.
That's what I'm betting on, because from day one, I've always believed that Luthen Rael was a dead man walking, because there's really no way one individual can stir up that much trouble and survive. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.